The Canadian Foundation for Cross-Cultural Dialogue proudly introduces its new project, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, Builder of Today's Canada. Learn more about this important political figure with your family, friends, and classmates. Visit laurier175.ca to discover animated clips, a comic strip, and a teaching guide. Above all, enter the web contest for a chance to win a trip to Ottawa.
Radio Malaspina 101.7 FM CHLY, your community radio.
And there you are. Welcome to Altered Egos again. We're deep into the second hour now, and I have Nicole Lebrasseur of www.i-accuse.com on the line. Good morning, Nicole.
Hey, good morning, everybody. And Bob, how are you?
Well, I made it through this far. I'm doing pretty well, I think.
Yeah, well, from what I've heard, never a dull moment in your neck of the woods.
And it's going to get even more exciting over the next months and years, probably at least into a full year. Lots going on, and a lot of it is not a coincidence. It's very interesting how you've popped into the scene here on Altered Egos the last 8 months or so, beginning of the year, and the work you've done and the research on the authority of governance, where it comes from, and especially recently, because it's so obvious now, after a year of the Liberal government federally and 10 years of a neo-fascist conservative government, that the mass of Canadians do not get what they vote for through our election process. And the key word is fiduciary. So what's that all about?
Yeah, absolutely. During my research, I was looking at the obligations of government and to the citizens, because, first of all, it didn't make sense that they pledge an allegiance to the crown, to the Queen herself, and that, all of our public offerings, she is the sole owner, the sole shareholder in Canada. So it was like, okay, how can we, because of 1982 and 1931, we should have been able to restructure a new constitution. And even since 1982, they have not allowed us that benefit. And in trying to see how Canadians can enforce this and force the government to do that, I ran across all of the Supreme Court documents in regards to fiduciary duty, and only to find out that in public law, there's no such thing as fiduciary duty for the Canadian citizens.
So, public law, private law, what's the difference?
Public law is where you have the government, and private law is if you hire a lawyer or whatever, or a company to look after your assets, or a doctor towards the patients. And even when you're looking at the doctor towards their patients in private law, they're walking away from this. They're trying to alleviate the responsibility of doctors to fiduciary duty. So when you're looking at the Supreme Court cases, you can see the amount of documents and the replies from the judges on how they are trying to, control the fact that the police do not owe fiduciary duty to you as a person. They only owe fiduciary duty to the citizens as a whole. So if somebody is trying to sue a police officer for risking their child's injury or whatever, they will get off scot-free because they owe you no fiduciary duty.
What happens when a whole mass of people are kettled by police, and all of them have had their rights to freedom of expression and to assembly? All of them have had their rights violated. So how then does that get addressed in law?
Well, the way that gets addressed in law is that everybody is charged on the individual basis, and therefore there's no fiduciary duty. And the way that they see it is that the police had to be involved to protect the rest of the citizens against the protesters. So the police are justified.
I see. Okay.
So if we went to court, if we needed to go to court to say, hey, we're the citizens as a whole, they know that that's practically impossible, that the people will not all get together and do this and all, go ahead with court procedures to represent everybody as a whole. And to be able to do that, everybody would have to stand up who's 18 years and over and a full citizen of Canada. So they know that's not going to happen. So this is the line that they use against anybody who goes to court.
So the MPs and the MLAs, at least, are in a super conflict of interest, really, because they get voted in by you and me, allegedly, although we don't get much of a choice on that. And then they swear allegiance to some other entity. Actually, they are compradors. They are domestic agents of a foreign power.
Well, she's not considered a foreign power, and this is where people keep making the mistake. She was declared the Queen of Canada back in the 50s. Or 50s or 60s. I think it was 60s. No, in the 50s, I believe. So anyways, I'd have to recheck that date. But she was declared the Queen of Canada, no longer the Queen of, representing us as the Queen of Britain.
So if we look up Canada on the stock market, it's there. And it's defined as CK, capital C, capital K, and then a bunch of zeros and a few numbers. But I'm sure I'll be bringing that forward so people can go look and see that actual. It lists the bonds and stuff that Canada puts on the market and the value of the dollar and a pile of other things. So the CK, is that for Canada Kingdom?
I couldn't say yes for sure on that one, but I'd assume, I don't think I'd be too wrong if I assume that yes, it is, because what they had to do to revert from the Imperial Crown to the Canadian Crown and to create the Crown Corporation of Canada, they had to declare Canada its own kingdom. And then declare the Queen as the Queen for the Canadian Kingdom.
That's wild.
And this is how we remained in a constitutional monarchy.
Right, which is almost an oxymoron, actually, when you think about it. And then as we've aired here on Altered Egos many times, the Prime Minister swears allegiance to the named Queen, Elizabeth II, Queen of England, her heirs and successors. Like there's no mistake to whom he has sworn allegiance, and that's through the Queen's Privy Council. So do we even have a shred of democracy other than the thing we do at election time? And if we don't, do we have a dictatorship in Canada?
We definitely have a dictatorship, and Rocco Galati has come out and said that as well. It's a quiet dictatorship, but it is a definite dictatorship because in order for them to have to pledge allegiance to the crown or the queen, one of the judges had said, because one of the new citizens refused to pledge, and the judge told them, well, you're going to have to pledge now and then we can revoke it after, but until we democratically change our constitution, they have to keep the status quo. They have to, and this is why we're in a de facto governance, because we're still going through the BNA Act, even though they changed it to the Constitution of Canada in 1982. It made no difference.
Wow.
So because we didn't renew our Constitution, we are de facto in the sense that we're still in third-party management until we create one. So now they have to pledge allegiance to the Queen. And when I was looking about, well, how could we turn taxation into dividends in Canada? First of all, their number one duty is to the people. Well, then I find out, no, their number one duty is to the Queen, because the Queen acts on behalf of the people, even through the new Constitution of the Patriot Constitution of 1982. So when you're looking at all this, and you're looking at the Canadian website, and it says the Parliament of Canada consists of the Queen, the Senate, and the House of Commons. In the provinces, legislatures consist of the Lieutenant Governor and the elected Assembly. Her Majesty's representatives act on the advice of the Prime Minister or ministers responsible to the House of Commons or the provincial legislative assemblies. Now, if for her to act on the advice of, she is now subordinate to the Prime Minister. Okay, let's get that straight.
Well,
and that happened in 1982.
Right, but we still have the Prime Minister openly swearing allegiance to the Queen of England.
Right, but she has remained our sovereign for that purpose. So now she takes a back seat to the government, okay, simply because she is recognized as the physical sovereign. And here is where the information comes from, again, from the Canadian government website. Here when it says the Queen's role, as the living embodiment of the Crown, Her Majesty unites Canadians, gives a collective sense of belonging to our country, and anchors our sense of national identity and pride. New Canadians swear allegiance to the Queen, so do members of Parliament and the legislatures, military and police officers. We do not swear allegiance to a piece of cloth, and they have in brackets office, a document, and in brackets is a constitution, or a political entity. Rather, we swear allegiance to a person who embodies all of these as well as our collective values as a people. So she represents the people. So if you look at Hydro One, okay, which is a public company, and even the Bank of Canada, the sole shareholder is the Queen in right of Ontario and in right of Canada.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So we're not shareholders of this country yet, then, is what you're saying. We don't have that status
and
as a
they're
shareholder.
saying we are, but through her. So if we have a problem, okay, with fiduciary duty in regards to how the government is managing our affairs, well, we have to go to her to force her to sue them. Bring them to court.
That's pretty unlikely. And anybody I know who has written a letter trying to get it to the Queen gets blocked by the Governor's General.
Well, it's conflict of interest. What,
Exactly.
she's got to sue herself?
Exactly.
It's conflict of interest.
Yes.
And therefore, the Constitution has not been valid, especially since 1982.
So
because we have not, and then they'll say, okay, in another part of the government website, I had to make sure that, yes, it's the people who rule since then. So, and they have it here in black and white and in a few other places. And it says, on April 17, 1982, the Queen promulgated the Constitution Act of 1982, which includes the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, recognition of the rights of Aboriginal peoples, and multicultural character of Canadian society, and patriation of the constitutional amending powers previously reserved to the British Parliament. Patriation reaffirmed the primacy of the rule of law and the sovereignty of the Canadian people over this country's institutions and constitution. Now, I'm going to read that again. Patriation reaffirmed the primacy of the rule of law and the sovereignty of the Canadian people over this country's institutions and constitutions. So now we are over the Constitution, above the Constitution. Because we have the right to change the Constitution. So we are the actual sovereigns, not the Queen.
All right, but we have this middleman between us called the elected politician who has sworn to the Queen herself, right? So we won't get those people to, ratify the Constitution. It's not ratified, really, is what you're saying.
Well, by common sense, the heads of the provinces should have forced that, but they will not because they like to be able to rule over the people. So yes, we are in a dictatorship because they've created laws over time, okay, to make sure that we have no rights. We cannot call a referendum. We cannot remove them out of office because they're not performing their duties. You see what I mean? So what we need to do is to be able to bring this to the Supreme Court and say, hey, we need you to admit right here, right now, with all of these, just these three facts, this proves that the Canadian people since 1982 are now above the Constitution and the institutions which is the government and the Parliament. So we are above all this. So it needs to reflect that so that we can actually act upon our authority. Because until it hasn't changed, we cannot act upon our authority. And these people will not give it to us. So the Supreme Court will say, well, your system of governance, that's up to you to do it. It's up to the politicians to do it, which is a crock of shit. Okay? Because when it's a constitutional issue, then the judges have the right to determine if these laws were valid to begin with. And they have not been valid at least since 1982 guaranteed. And everything before that since 1931.
It's pretty hard to believe that all the authorities we appeal to have sworn allegiance to the very problem we're appealing against.
Well, yeah, but see, this is where the bait and switch happens. Now, how can, Hydro One is a public entity. It's owned by the people, by the province, and it's supposed to, whatever monies it makes, should go back into the expenses of the province for the people. But now they're going into private, the public and private partnership, the 3 Ps. Now, what is going to happen? First of all, in Canada, the only ones that are held to fiduciary duty are band councils.
Okay.
Because they act for the Canadian government. Now, because of the treaties, yes, they are in a fiduciary duty under public law, but only to the nations.
Right.
Which, thank goodness, it is. And then, in that sense, so when you're looking at the veterans now, they say the only ones are the First Nations and the veterans, and the veterans because of their pensions, but not all military personnel. Okay, only when they become veterans. So there's a fine line there of responsibility, and you can see that the Supreme Court judges and the court cases, in front of them, the judges were deliberate in their answers to make sure that they found things like, the fiduciary duty is to the citizens as a whole. So no, the police is not here to protect you here in Canada. If you start screaming on the street, then you are a threat to all other Canadians, and he has the right to arrest you. And that is how he performs his fiduciary duty.
Right. So what that arrested victim could do is take their specific case to the Supreme Court as a charter issue. That would be the remedy.
No, because this is the key. See, they inserted the charter, and when somebody goes on a personal issue, they will stick it to you at the charter level. We need to address this at the Constitution level, the direct Constitution, where the Queen was removed from her responsibility as the sovereign. That has never been put in question.
How do we do that?
Well, we have to file. We have no other choice but at least file this in courts to have it established that it is the people that are the sovereigns and not the Queen.
So this is actually a legal argument and not one that requires, for example, in the Bank of Canada's case with Rocco Galati, he identified the complainant as a group, Comer, and that's not the Canadian mass, so to speak.
No, well, Comer, first of all, I don't know why the Supreme Court judges didn't throw that right out of court to begin with, because Comer is a group of people. And 3 years ago, at least when 3 years ago happened, that's when that court case should have not qualified anymore to go to the Supreme Court, for the simple reason that the Supreme Court has ordered that you cannot represent the population unless you have their signatures, and that they've officially made you their representative.
So when we take this file, as you're saying, to the Supreme Court, how do we identify ourselves and not fall into that same problem?
Well, what we have to do is accuse the file, is basically go to the courts and say, hey, I'm sorry, but I think you have, oversighted this. And as a citizen, a personal citizen, so I have to explain why, as a personal citizen, it affects me, or to go at it as my company is Age Santé Research, and to go as a research company to question these facts. So I could go in there as a corporation against the governance of Canada in regards to the Constitution not being updated to revert the sovereignty to the people and not to the Queen.
I see. Okay. Wow. So you've been covering a fair bit of ground here with this research, and it's very timely, as I've been saying. Go ahead.
Well, over the past 100 years, at least, that I can see, we've had judges, we've had lawyers, students, you name it, do research on this. And they're still debating this. Even I found one document just today, and it's called Fiduciary Duty and Members of Parliament. And this is by Lindsay Agard, okay? And this was published, it's in the Canadian Parliamentary Review website, which is revparl.ca, revparl.ca. And she discussed this. And if you look at Paul Finn, who was a federal judge in Australia, he wrote a book in 1977 in regards to fiduciary obligations. And the debate is that although they have fiduciary obligation and it's strict enough on the private side, it does not exist on the public, in public law. So, and there's no reason for it not to exist in public law. Okay? But the thing is these people are all usually lawyers who end up in court and as judges and as whatnot. So you can read between the lines here. There's no way in hell that any of these politicians or the courts are going to make sure that they pledge an allegiance or are held to fiduciary duty to the citizens of Canada, because then they are bringing in the law against themselves. It's the same thing. They will never, allow us to vote away their wealth. So how do we do this as a people, to protect ourselves against politicians who have removed all feasible laws that could have protected us against them, and none exist? And then the Supreme Court says, well, we can't judge on that because there's no law to judge on.
Wow, so we have to establish that.
So the judges can only judge on the law that exists. So you can see the BS around this. And when you have a judge like Paul Finn, and then you have a gentleman, Evan Fox Dissent, he's written a lot of stuff, and this is in the Yale Law Journal, but he's from McGill University, and he says, keeping the promise of public fiduciary theory. And then, there's lots of stuff that's written about here and they're talking about, how governments are lying about their fiduciary duty to the people. And there's numerous information on this. They've done a lot of research. They debate it. Their debates are excellent. And yet it still has not appeared at the Supreme Courts anywhere in the world where there's, and this affects the same Commonwealth countries. This could have been established in any of the Commonwealth countries, including the United States, because our law all derives from the same things.
Exactly. That part really threw me, the United States, where the states have authority over the federal government as provinces do, or the federal government in Canada. Is that correct?
No, and this is where people have to realize that the heads of the provinces are in cahoots to keep that federal government doing the corruption that they're doing against the people. Because the provinces, since 1931, they know. Why do you think Quebec is a distinct society? Quebec has been holding the federal government and the other provinces by the balls since 1931. Because when 1931 happened, we did not initiate a new constitution, and they are blatant about this. The reason why they did not do that was to be able to prevent the First Nations from renegotiating their treaties, and for the Canadian citizens to become more demanding on them.
Gotcha. And
to make them accountable to their actions.
Well, we see that lack of accountability now in spades, with the present government making all the promises it did to get elected a year ago, and now pretty well every one of the primary issues they promised for the Canadian public, they've backtracked on, and there's only one or two left of significance that they could bring forward, and I'm not hopeful at this stage So it sure looks like what you're saying is exactly what's gone down, and that's the source of the problems where Canadians do not get, A, the type of people they want running for Parliament or for the legislatures, and B, the outcomes from political decisions that should be for the benefit of all Canadians. Instead, more and more are going for the benefit of multinational corporations and groups that sit on the Queen's Privy Council. And that's quite significant, the Queen's Privy Council. That seems to be the linkage between our MPs and the historical governance of this country.
Yeah, but if you look at the Queen's Privy Council, they're saying that their decision-making authority was kind of abolished 30 years ago, which would mean back in the 80s, right? It was actually abolished in Australia. So I have to do more research on that for Canada as to what their actual legal status is. But if you see, the Queen's Privy Council no longer makes decisions.
However, the Prime Minister swore secrecy to, and he would give his all to the Queen's Privy Council, and he wouldn't say anything about it publicly. That's pretty much what he swore.
Yeah, exactly. But see, there's, again, the bait and switch. Now, when you look at fiduciary duty and members of Parliament in the essay that Lindsay Agard wrote, that is sitting, on the Parliament website, here it says, Canada's status as a constitutional monarchy is evident in the oath of office sworn by members of Parliament at the beginning of every term. As the Queen is the head of state, parliamentary actions are carried out in her name. However, as Eugene Forsey points out, the authority for those actions flows from the citizens, the constituents, as we will discuss shortly. The oath contained in the 5th schedule of the Constitution requires that the member be faithful and bear true allegiance to the sovereign, and was implemented in order to guarantee the supremacy of the British sovereign over anything else. The oath of office is a formal and essentially mandatory manifestation of an obligation central to our system of government, the obligation to be faithful to the sovereign. The presence of the sovereign in the oath does not mean that loyalty is required to the Queen personally, but rather serves to evoke the Queen as the symbol of personification of the country, its constitution and traditions, including concepts such as democracy. As James Robertson writes, elected members are assuming positions of public trust, and with the oath of office they promise to conduct themselves patriotically and in the best interests of the country. This oath is clearly central to Canada's political status as a constitutional monarchy. Nevertheless, it should be noted that the workings of the oath also emphasize the importance of the citizenry. So now, but legally, okay, it's all well and good. Their intentions, it's still for the people, but we have no legal standing whatsoever until we change this Constitution.
So when...
And the ones responsible for it, from what I've read, the courts are, running away from their responsibility to do this. Of course, they're paid by the government, right? So they're not going to say, hey, guess what? You should change your Constitution. They're trying to give us some hints, but at the same time, who is going to bring it forth? But the courts were saying they have no rights to decide for this. Yes, they do, because now it's a constitutional issue. It was changed in 1982, and the changes have to reflect the Constitution. Therefore, we need a referendum to make sure that everybody's on board for this, or maybe not even a referendum, because it should be an automatic.
Would that qualify as an item on the next election ballot?
Oh, definitely. It would have to be. And this is where even the electoral reform needs to be advised and brought to court to make sure that that is on the ballot, and to make sure that our parliamentarians are held to fiduciary duty. There should be no difference between public law and private law as far as any members of parliament or anybody that works for Canadians to not be held to fiduciary responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Well,
they hold us responsible as corporations and businesses. Hey, the Crown Corporation of Canada is a corporation. So why is it okay for them not to, but every other corporation under Canada to be held liable for fiduciary duty?
Good point. That's a solid point right there.
Well, I mean, they can't say yes for one and no for the other.
Yes.
And then it's the same thing with First Nations. If they're in charge of the bank accounts for the First Nations and healthcare and everything else, I mean, they do the same for us. Why are they not accountable to us?
Yes, our sisters and brothers.
Bingo. You know, so, and if they screw up in government and make these horrific trade deals and, you know, we're losing our natural resources, that is bad faith.
Well, they claim, and this is where it gets difficult to define properly, but as Trudeau said recently with the pipelines, that this is in the best interests of the country. Well, how do you measure something so subjective as that?
Whose best interest? And according to who? According to whose definition? I mean, you should see my table. I've got arguments on fiduciary duty and the court cases from Australia to New Zealand to the United States to Canada, and a lot of them use Canada as an example. And when you've got people like Paul Finn and, you know, Evan Fox Dissent and all of these other lawyers who are making a really, really sound argument, because it is common sense to hold them accountable.
Well, you have to. Otherwise, what have you got?
Common sense. How can you argue common sense? And yet they do it. They renege on it. Why? Because they're the ones in power to be able to create laws, and they will not create laws against themselves.
Well, it's got to the point now where they got themselves elected based on a very, very important statement, and that is that it was the last first-past-the-post election in 2015, and now we're hearing this week that the panel has reported, and the government is not seeing a consensus, and so there won't be a change.
I'm glad there won't be a change for proportional representation. And this is what people need to understand, because proportional representation does not give us a change.
I hear you.
And in the meantime, we can still force the electoral system to add direct democracy. They were supposed to give us all kinds of different opportunities for us to look towards in a new system of democracy. But they've only given us one, which is proportional representation. And if you look, I mean, I've got proof that the NDP had actually come up with the idea of open government, or they made it look like the NDP had the idea. But you know what? This was 2 years later, and Stephen Harper had already created the open government website. And then the NDP was asking for it, and they got hailed for, oh, what a great idea. And, you know, they were trying to push for this, and all along, nobody said a word. The website was already active on the government website. Harper didn't even argue that, oh, we already have one. No, they kept that hush-hush. So all parties work together.
Gotcha.
Once they get elected, they have no choice but to toe the part, to get puppeted by those who tell them what to do, because it's totally different once they get in power. So now we have the NDP suggesting this, and then Trudeau comes in and says, oh, we're going to have a website open government. Well, I'm sorry, but I've got a screenshot that states 2011 on that website. And then I've got videos where Obama and Harper got together on establishing this worldwide at the orders of the United Nations.
And here we go back to the central global power.
Exactly. So who got the credit for this? Trudeau, that never did nothing in regards to that website. It was Harper all along.
Okay, so we're coming really close to the end of the show. If you could give us a heads up on your new political game, the app.
Yes.
And you only have a couple minutes. Yes.
Okay, yeah, so we have what we call the Memi Democracy Trivia app, and you can find that on iTunes or Google Play. And the app consists of trivia questions in relevance to democracy. And this is to be able to help people to educate themselves and then have a game at the same time. And they can engage their friends and family to play along with them. And, we have questions like, what is a democracy? And then they have to pick, one of four choices. And then like what is a Canadian political party system. And then we have some even harder ones. In Canada are the communities and municipalities protected by the Canadian Constitution. And guess what? It is not. So this is another thing that we could, question, is the fact that people are not protected under their municipalities. Why? Because they're corporations. So you'll find all of this information in the app and on our websites. And through the app, we have a link to the CHLY to shows that they can listen at any time to anybody that they want to listen to on CHLY, but hopefully always to yours as well, Bob.
Thank you for that.
Well, the thing is people need to know the truth, and CHLY offers that chance, with Democracy Now! and all of these other fantastic hosts. So we thought, okay, we're going to add this to our Democracy app. And this app is to be able to help people have fun and try to get more involved in what a democracy is, because it's never been so important right now to instill a direct democracy and to make our politicians accountable, because no matter what they do, there is no recourse whatsoever for citizens to make them accountable. Nothing. And the courts will tell you that, and all of these researchers will tell you that.
And we're seeing the results of that week by week now. So we're suffering through this. Now, this is the best time of all to bring this app forward and to have you on air with the research you've collected and put together and explain it to us. This is a hugely important thing, possibly the most important time in the governance of these territories since 1867, roughly. So I think...
Yes, and it's high time. It's high time that they actually made the citizens the sovereigns.
Excellent.
Not the Queen.
Okay. I have to end the interview. I thank you very much again, Nicole Lebrasseur of www.i-accuse.com. And people can find the app's location and descriptions at that website too?
On that website, but mostly on directdemocracyschool.com, or, like I said, it's Mammy's Democracy Trivia.
Yep.
If they just Google Democracy Trivia, they'll find it on iTunes and on Google Play.
Thank you very much, my dear. Have yourself a great week, and we'll be talking to you shortly.
Okay, fantastic.
My
See
pleasure.
you next week.
You betcha. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Nicole Lebrasseur of i-accuse.com. Hugely important project they've got going. And you can see why with the decisions we're getting week by week with the last...
Hello.